Well, hello there. I didn't see you come in. Make yourself at home. Have a drink. While I give some attention to some underappreciated characters and storylines that I personally love. And I hope you grow to love as well.
Hey there, everybody. Welcome back. Today we are reading Swamp Thing number 116. And last time we wrapped up the Dark Conrad pirate storyline where some evil demonic pirates tried to sacrifice Swamp Thing's child Tefe in order to resurrect some eldritch gods. And that one ended with Swamp Thing, of course, kicking some pirate ass. And of course, the eldritch gods did not get raised. Although I have a feeling, although I don't know for sure, that possibly some of these eldritch god storylines or some of the other little story threads that weren't necessarily left hanging, but they were just put out there and weren't grown upon, those will come back in the future. But issue 116 is a standalone issue because it's a fill-in. So first things first, with issue 116, we see the cover. And I gotta say, this is one of the few instances where the interior art is much, much better than the cover. Because the cover, it looks like someone took the prop of Swamp Thing from the movies, threw some grass on it, put some smoke around it, and took a picture. So we just get the slightest top half of Swamp Thing's head peeking out of some water that has some smoke or fog on it, and there's some branches and grass around him. So definitely not the best cover, probably one of the worst ones I've seen in this whole second volume of Swamp Thing. And we see the writer of this issue on the cover is Dick Foreman with art by Sean McManus. Both have written and drawn for Swamp Thing before. I believe Dick Foreman wrote a fill-in issue during the Doug Wheeler run, and then Sean McManus has dropped in every now and then. He did the famous story in the Alan Moore run where there's like aliens that also look like baby alligators, and that was very cartoony. So Sean McManus has a very cartoony style, which fit that one and some of the other ones he's been on. And this is no exception. The art is fantastic in this issue. So we start off on the first page with a kid in the middle of the bayou who has found one of Swamp Thing's discarded bodies. You know how Swamp Thing will grow a body and then leave the old one as he goes into the green? Well, those are all over the place, which would be terrifying, I think, just to have like human-esque looking bodies that are plants just rotting all over the bayou. So a kid has found one of these and he is looking into it because he's like, what the hell? Like, this looks like a person and it has organs and stuff, but I'm not exactly sure what it is because it's not a human. So, and this kid's name is Casey, by the way. So Casey is narrating all this. So his narration says, "This must be its heart, cradled by gnarled root-like ribs, dry and wrinkled, already pockmarked by a few insect tunnels. Shouldn't there be tubes? What did it pump, sap? And below the heart, decayed shreds of something resembling a sponge. All that remains of its lungs? Did it breathe air like we do?" He gingerly reaches into the chest cavity. The stuff just crumbles at his touch. What was it once? How did it work? And then we get a panel where he's holding one of the eyeballs from one of these discarded bodies, and it's all deflated and gross looking, and the narration continues. This he found lying beside its head. At first he took it for a withered fruit that had somehow lasted the winter. Examining it more carefully, he notices the pupil and the iris. And this is the socket from which it must have fallen. Like a cavern, it opens up to the brain, now a mass of writhing caterpillars. Are they its last thoughts? Or has its life force soaked into the ground, giving strength to the new spring growth of creepers and grasses? Perhaps, but here's a part of it that seems to be living still. And we see the boy find one of Swamp Thing's tubers, which is a yam that kind of grows around Swamp Thing's body, and the narration continues. He doesn't know how the swamp creature died, or why, or when. He doesn't know much about the life it lived, just some stories in the schoolyard, a newspaper item he once saw. He doesn't know the part it played in the elemental scheme of things, nor why its body seems to fill him with a sense of peaceful presence. But one thing he does know, now it's the time when new things are planted, to be nurtured through the heat-drenched summer, between the time of sowing and the time of reaping. It lies ahead. Then we see the name of this issue is called The Growing Season. So then we see little Casey pack up his stuff. I should say this boy is about, I don't know, maybe 11 or 12. And you can tell from his clothes that they don't have a lot of money. And we also see that as he packs up and goes home, his home was actually a mobile home inside of a trailer park. And we see his mom returning from shopping. I don't know if she was at work first, but she definitely seems pretty tired, so I think she was. And as she brings in the groceries, we see that Casey is reading a book on plants called The Garden Book. And the way the mom's drawn makes her look like she's maybe in her mid-30s, and she's white with red hair, and she wears glasses. She kind of looks like a less eccentric and more tired version of Mrs. Frizzle from the Magic School Bus. So as she sets down the groceries, she sees Casey and says, "It's been a heck of a day, kiddo, but you've heard that one before. How about you? Did you go to school today like I asked you to?" And Casey says, "Sure, Mom. After that, I went out to check the tuber." And the mom is like, I don't know what you're talking about. And he says, "I told you, Mom, the one I found in the body of the swamp creature." So we get here that obviously she doesn't listen to him that much when he talks. And a lot of that is probably because they're poor, because we see her, as he's telling her about this tuber, looking in the back of the cabinet, and she says, "Damn, I could have sworn we had another couple of cans of beans in here. What were you saying, honey?" So it seems like maybe she's neglected Casey a little bit, but only because she's so worried about trying to feed them. And Casey reminds her that he was talking about the tuber that he just planted, and she says, "Well, it's good to grow things. I'll bet we have a fine crop of tomatoes this year. Oh, and I almost forgot. Look, this is that new kind of cereal we saw the other night. It sure looked good on the TV." So we see from that she's trying to give him some kind of fun in his life. But we also see that as she finishes putting away the groceries, she sits down at the table and she pulls out a bottle of alcohol. And she says, "I could use a drink. My feet are killing me." And then Casey, kind of out of nowhere, asks if she's heard anything from his dad. And she says, "Do I ever? We'll see him when he comes and not before. That's all I know. Do you miss him?" And Casey kind of looks sad and he says, I don't know." And the mom also looks sad as she kind of stares into her glass. And then she brings it up to her lips as she's like going to drink the whole thing, it seems. And she says, "You know something? I ain't sure if I do either." So then we cut to a couple minutes later, I'm assuming, where Casey is getting some water ready to bring to the plant that he is growing from the tuber that he planted from Swamp Thing. And the narration says, "He leaves his mother watching soaps like she always does. Last time he looked, the tuber had a shoot, like a tiny finger beckoning up from the soil. But it hasn't rained, and it might need water." So then we see little vignettes of the areas that Casey's walking by to get to this plant. And he walks by a cotton patch, and it says, "Ed Thirlwell's cotton patch is coming up too. There's always a strip in the center which he leaves unplanted. Casey's never figured out why." And then Casey walks by a car that looks like it's kind of buried halfway in mud, and the narration continues. "And there's the battered hulk of Steve Cahill's Cadillac, blown half a mile or so by last year's hurricane. Casey wonders how many years it'll take before it turns to dust. By the time he gets to his secret place, the back of Casey's shirt is soaked with sweat. The cacophony of grasshoppers and shrill bird songs seem to swell now, like an organic fanfare." And then we see Casey smiling as he gets to where he's planted this Swamp Thing tree. And I gotta say, if I was a kid, I would be terrified of this tree. It literally looks like an arm growing out of the ground, but at the base of the arm, there's like ears and stuff, like it's trying to grow a Swamp Thing body or something. And as it comes out, the arm really, really narrows, but you see a hand drooping at the end of this small stalk that's grown, and the hand is palm up, and inside the palm is an eyeball. And if I had come upon that plant as a child, I would have immediately killed it. But Casey doesn't, because he's a fan of growing things, and this thing is growing fast. Then we cut to the swamp sometime after school, and we see that Casey and a friend of his named Irv are hanging out in that car that is half buried in the mud. And Casey's trying to explain to Irv this cool plant that he's growing. He's drawing him a picture and showing him it. And apparently Irv has never gone to the swamps with Casey before, because he says, "I don't know how you can go to the swamps all by yourself. They give me the creeps." And Casey replies, "Nah, some of the places my dad goes to, now they're creepy. Whorehouses and stuff like that." And then the kids talk about the scary stuff in the swamp, and Irv mentions that this is actually the furthest he's ever gone, and he would not want to go further because of alligators and stuff. And then Irv pulls out a couple sandwiches that are peanut butter sandwiches, actually, and he gives one to Casey, which is super nice of him. And he says, "You know what I figure heaven ought to be like?" And as Casey says no and bites into a sandwich, Irv continues, "There'd be like an endless supply of mom's sandwiches, and fudge sundaes, and peaches, and those beautiful sweet tomatoes like your mom grows. Just all the food I could eat and never turn into a blimp. How about you, Case?" And as Casey munches on his sandwich, he kind of thinks for a second. He says, "I guess I'd like that too. But mostly I'd like there to be a big old house for me and my mom to live in, and I'd just be able to take care of her, make her happy." Then we cut to Casey back at home, and it looks like he's doing homework at the dinner table, but also his mom is there drinking and talking to him. And we get some narration that says, "Her moods are distinct, as dark clouds are from blue skies. But where does the weather come from? And as the mom drinks, she kind of looks up and she thinks back to her younger days and she says, "Your daddy looked so fine when I first met him. He used to have a quiff like those rockabilly guys. He used to ride a motorcycle and I was real scared the first time he took me for a ride. Don't ever be a sucker for the way people look, Casey. It's dumb. It's just plain dumb. But sometimes you just can't help it. You know that someone's telling you lies, but you want to believe them all the same. You know what I'm saying?" And Casey, who's just trying to do some homework, kind of looks at her and says, "I don't know, maybe?" And the mom continues, "Fact is, kid, your father's nothing but trouble. You know that, I know that. I mean, level with me. You glad to see him when he shows his face around here?" And Casey replies, He can be kind of scary, I guess. I kind of like it better when he ain't around." And his mom says, "Well, listen now. We don't have to be here the next time he comes. This place could be empty and we could be in Missouri with your Aunt Mary. I got it figured out. That's exactly what we're going to do, just as soon as the right time comes along." And then she pours herself another full glass of alcohol. And we see Tommy looking at that glass like all the wishes that him and his mom could get out of this place are being drunk up in that glass. Then we cut to a rainy day. I don't know how long it's been since that last conversation with his mom, but he is out and he's looking at his plant, and now his plant in the swamp is gigantic. The base of it, which kind of looked like ears and stuff, is now as tall as he is. And we don't even see the top of it, so I'm assuming it's, 20 plus feet tall. And Casey's there, like, looking up at it, smiling, and the narration says, "It doesn't need to be the new swamp creature. Irv's cousin in Gotham saw loads of the swamp thing's bodies when it went there. It doesn't die. It makes new bodies and leaves the old ones lying around like discarded overcoats. So this plant is simply itself. He'll be sorry to leave it if they really go to Missouri, but it seems to grow fine now. It doesn't need him anymore. It makes him feel good to think that he grew it himself. It's so big now, like it already aged by years. A big, old, friendly tree, strong and comforting. A tree of limbs with a knee that you could climb onto." And then Casey heads back to his house, and the narration continues. "One time, Casey overheard Ed Thirlwell talking about his dad, saying that Dan Quigley was a drunkard and a thief and a liar, and that he'd slept with every whore in Baton Rouge. It couldn't be denied. The old man's been like that for as long as Casey can remember, and there's a lot that Ed doesn't know besides. But there's a new feeling that comes when Casey's out with the tree of limbs. It's safe, as fathers should be." So Casey gets back into his mobile home, and he sees his mom at the dinner table with all the bills and a calculator, and she's saying, "Money! Damn it, we need money to get out of here." And of course, Casey hears this and says, "What about Aunt Mary? I thought you said..." But he gets cut off by his mom saying, I gave her a call. She said I knew what he was like when I married him. I got a bit argumentative, and well, I don't think she's willing to help us out anymore." And Casey looks super disappointed, and she says, "I know what you're thinking, Casey, but I mean it this time. Just as soon as we get a few bucks together, we're going to pack our bags. You hear me? He ain't going to mess up our lives anymore." But as she's saying this, we cut to the outside of the trailer home, and we see someone walking towards the front door. And as she says he's not going to mess our lives up anymore, someone knocks on the door and kind of startles them, and she says, "Were you expecting anyone, Casey?" And Casey says no. So they open the door cautiously, and they see it is in fact Casey's dad is back, and he says, "Hello, Lena. You gonna let me in?" And he kind of lets himself in. He just walks in, and she says, "Dan, But the dad cuts her off saying, "Casey, ain't you gonna come give your old man a hug?" And Casey does not. He just stays where he is, and the dad turns to the mom and says, "What was that, Lena? Bet you're real glad to see me, ain't you?" And she puts on a fake smile and says, "Why, sure, Dan. Sure I am." And the dad goes over to her, and he gives her like a small hug, and I guess you'd call it nuzzling. I don't know. He rubs his head on hers. And Casey, who's still terrified, hasn't gone over to him. And the dad looks at both of them, and he says, "I guess now's as good a time as any to give you two, well, some good news. You see, this evening, I stand before you a different man. I've been a sinner, I know that now, but I've been saved by the mercy of Jesus Christ our Lord." And then he puts his hands on either side of the mom's shoulders, and he looks at her in the eyes and says, "Can you believe me? Can you take it in your heart to forgive me?" And it seems like maybe the mom's buying into it, or maybe she's just scared. I can't really tell. But she says, "Dan, I've never heard you talk like this before, but if it's true," and then Dan cuts her off saying, "It's true, all right, and I'm about to change my ways. Get a job and stay right here and keep you two like I always shoulda. That's how the Lord wants it. We could be a family again." And as he says this last part, he pulls Casey and her next to him, and they both look terrified as he says this. Then we see them a little bit later that night, sitting on the couch, drinking some coffee, and the narration says, "Casey's father seems so much older, paler, thinner, and his stomach keeps making noises." And I didn't catch this the first time I read it, but there's a couple times where the narration kind of explains something's wrong with his stomach. I believe the narration is insinuating that he has stomach cancer. They don't ever outright say it, but I'm pretty sure that's what it is. So like I said, they're sitting on the couch, and the dad is talking to the mom, and he's saying, "So you see, excuse me, you don't have to work at the diner no more." And the mom says, "But Dan, I like having something to do." But Dan cuts her off saying, "Why, there's work to be done here, Lena. You can keep this place nice and clean, cook those fine meals of yours, and give young Casey here some parental guidance. Fact is, boy, you got me kind of worried." And then we see Dan's hand reach out to Casey's hair, and he's kind of pulling on it, and he says, "How you going to hear the word of the Lord with all that hair covering up your ears?" And we see Casey does not like that, and we get some narration that says, "His breath smells of something rotten." And then we get to later that night where Casey is listening through the wall at his parents talking in their bedroom, and the dad says, "And don't you be getting any ideas, Lena. I ain't falling for any of your temptation. The good book says that God's love is more wonderful than the love of women, you hear? So there ain't no reason to dress up like a harlot now, is there?" And we cut to inside the room, and he's sitting in like a sleeveless undershirt and boxers, and she's wearing a nightgown, but it's one that covers everything completely. So as he says this line about being a harlot, she looks down and says, "Harlot, but this ain't, oh Dan, I don't know what you mean." And then Dan says, "That meeting just changed my whole life. It was the voice of God speaking directly to me, and I knew right then I had to come back and share it with the two of you." Then we cut to the next day where they're eating dinner at the dinner table, and the dad is sharing the lessons he's learned from the Bible so far, and he says, "So let me tell you about the judgment which is to come. Let me tell you about the rapture." And he actually uses the food here on his plate as part of his explanation of what the rapture is. So he's got a plate here that has a bunch of divisions on it so all the food can stay separated, like a cafeteria tray at school. And one of those has peas, and he decides to compare peas to human beings who are getting pulled up to heaven, and heaven is his mouth. And I don't think it really makes that much sense, but he's trying to make it work. And this is a side note, but it kind of reminded me of an old SNL sketch where Phil Hartman played Bill Clinton, who was on a run, and then he stops at a McDonald's and he's trying to explain to the people what's going on in Somalia, and he's using like the chicken nuggets and the burgers at the McDonald's to explain how food is being intercepted by warlords. And so it's pretty amazing sketch. You should all check it out. So anyway, Dan is talking about the peas going to heaven, and then he's talking about the peas that are left behind, and he says, "But back here, all the souls of the atheists and the pagans and the idolaters who don't deserve to share in the rapture. For them, this here fork is an instrument of vengeance." And then he begins to smash and stab at the other things on the plate. And then his face gets all crazy and he says, "See, down there it's hotter than any microwave oven, because down there is the pits of hell and eternal torment." And then he throws the tray across the table and all the food goes flying. And the mom is looking pretty scared as this happens. Then we cut to another day where now the dad has made Casey wear Christian clothes, I guess. He's in some nicer pants and a nice dress shirt, and he's got a tie on. And his friend Irv is chasing after him, kind of wondering why he looks like he does. And Casey's trying to tell him that his dad's making him dress like this because his dad's found religion. And their little meeting ends with Irv asking if the dad's going to stay around this time. And Casey says, "I don't know. Mom thinks he's changed for real, but I ain't so sure." And then we see a little flashback of some night where we see that Casey has snuck out of the house and is hiding behind a tree as he watches his dad reach into a storage shed and pull out a liquor bottle, like this is where he's been hiding his alcohol. And then we cut back to the kids, and Irv is asking how that plant is doing. And Casey says, I never seen anything grow that way. And it's got these sort of tunnel things growing through the ears. I think maybe I could get inside. And then we cut to a panel of Casey just looking up in excitement as he, I guess, gets to the tree of limbs. And we don't see how big it is yet, but we get some narration that says, in the shadow of the tree of limbs, the rest of his life is a half-remembered movie. If only he could just stay here, lost in a mute fascination, and begin to explore the secrets it's hiding. But he doesn't seem to have the time anymore. Then we jump to some months later, and we're seeing like little vignettes of Casey's family life and what it's like now that the dad is back and kind of staying here seemingly for a while. We see his mom's tomatoes have grown. We see her pouring out her alcohol. We see the dad kind of getting more and more controlling of Casey. And he's also not satisfied with the way that Casey doesn't seem to be excited about going to church and whatnot. So over these panels, there's some narration that says, June lazily nudges May aside, and the growing season comes into its fullness. Things change as they always do, bud to bloom and grub to sparkling dragonfly. As without, so within. But here, to Casey, the change seems forced. His mother doesn't speak of Missouri anymore, and his father takes his wife and son to meetings where drifting souls seek out an anchor. It means nothing to Casey. He'd rather drift. Then we get a panel of Irv and Casey hanging out in the swamp, and the narration continues. Moments of freedom are precious. Lunch breaks by the riverside with Irving. Rare clandestine visits to the secret place where the swamp plant grows so tall. Sometimes he thinks he can feel it out there, going through its changes, waiting to welcome him once more to take him into its own green rapture. And that page ends with Casey and his mom coming home with groceries. And it seems they've come home early because as they get through the front door, they see the dad sitting on the couch drinking alcohol, which he's not supposed to do. And upon seeing this, the mom makes a little quip saying, it doesn't look like you were expecting us just yet. And the dad gets angry right away saying, and what's that supposed to mean? And the mom says, well, ain't that a bottle of wine you're drinking from? And the dad yells back, a man can take a little refreshment, can he? Jesus Christ himself wasn't ashamed to partake in a little wine, Lena. Wasn't it good enough for him? And seeing his quickness to anger, Lena realizes this is kind of a dangerous situation, and she tries to calm it down by saying, I'm sorry, Dan. I didn't mean anything. But it seems it's too late, and Dan is already in a mood, and he's drunk, so he says, sorry ain't good enough, woman. It ain't right for you to be criticizing the man you swore to love, honor, and obey. And then the dad reaches down to his belt and begins to loosen it, and we get some narration that says, his father's face contorts. It reddens, capillaries surging with bluster and venom. It's the way it was before. It eats him from the inside like the corruption in his guts. Not even God can soothe it away. So the dad takes off his belt and he's wrapping it around his fists like he's going to hit her with it. And he says, the Bible says a man shall be Lord and master of his own home. Seems to me I got a little chastising to do here. But before he really gets to it, Casey kind of runs in between the mom and the dad and says, no, Pa, you ain't changed. You ain't different at all. You just swallowed something so you could hide the bad stuff down in your belly. But I can smell it, Pa. Every time you burp, I can smell it coming up. And then we get a panel of extreme close-up of the dad's eyes as they bug out, and he says, why, you little... And that's all Casey needed to hear. He begins to run away because he's terrified of his dad. And he actually makes it out of the house, and as the dad chases him, he kind of bends over in pain, and he says, ah, shit, goddamn stomach. But it's only a momentary pause, because as Casey's running, we get some narration that says, heavy footsteps behind him. But Casey's the roadrunner, the lisping bird, the smart mouse. On this ground, he knows he'll give the old man the slip for sure, just like they always do. Still, the footsteps. What if he's wrong? What if his father does have God on his side? Is that why, even this far, he can't seem to lose him? Casey stumbles but does not stop. Into the bayou, and the pursuit continues. No, God doesn't work that way. It must be something else that drives his father on. Something bad. And of course, Casey, knowing that there's a giant tree that he's been growing for a long time, he goes there because that's where he feels safe. And we don't see it initially, but as you turn the page, we get the big reveal, and this thing looks crazy. It is maybe like 100 feet tall, and it has the ears at the base like it was before, but now the body's a lot thicker. It is still covered with moss and everything. There is an outjut that looked like it was the hand that initially was there, and there is still the giant eyeball in the center of it, But it also looks like above that, there's kind of a mock Swamp Thing face. And at the very top of that, there's like a pool of water that kind of looks like it could be its brain. So as Casey runs up to it, the narration says, "Here it stands, before him, its great green sinews stretching skywards, refuge." And as the dad catches up with Casey, he sees it and he's like, "What the?" And then the narration continues, "Here it stands, vast, monstrous, the devil's work or worse." And Casey runs into one of the openings that looks like an ear at the base of this thing. And the dad yells for Casey to stay out of there. And the narration says, "His voice sounds small and fragile against the insect rowdiness of the glade. But here by Casey it echoes loudly, sharp and frightening. The smell of moss and loam is ripe in his nostrils, extending its invitation. And somewhere in Dan Quigley's mind, a balance fails." So what this seems to mean is that Dan is kind of lured in by maybe the pheromones or something of this plant because it's trying to protect Casey, who it likes. And even though I don't think Casey's really been inside to explore that much, he's just kind of crawling around. We see him kind of gripping things and going in different parts. And each time he goes into a different area, there's like fake organs that he's running into, and he's kind of knowing where he's at in the body of this thing. So as he's crawling around, the narration says, "Facsimile wax shines on the gristly inner skin. Light suffuses the interior. Ahead there are twists and turns, strange, familiar shapes. Here and there membranes stretch across the tunnel, stained glass drumskins in endless tones of green. Casey no longer knows what it is that surrounds him." And then we see Dan, who hasn't quite gone in, is debating whether he should go in or out. And the narration says, "Soft cilia lie crumpled beneath Dan's footsteps. His son's soul is part of his dominion. He will not let this thing steal it." So Dan decides to go in, and he begins to follow through these weird tubes that seem to be the ear canals. And the narration continues, "Past Malleus, Incus, and Stapus, he clambers, tracing Casey's trail in mucal deposits. His chest pounds, his stomach churns." Then we cut to Casey, who's a bit further up in this body of plant, and he eventually gets to like the heart area, and we see like a giant facsimile heart that's just squirting out sap or some other kind of liquid. And like we've already learned from the Alan Moore run, like Swamp Thing's bodies don't actually need any of these organs, so they're just kind of working like they think a human body would work, but they don't actually do anything to keep the plant alive. And as Casey's running through this thing, it seems like he's having a blast discovering all these different chambers, and like he gets to the heart and the lungs, and if he wasn't being chased by his abusive father, I'm sure this would be an awesome experience for him. So at one point while Casey's running, he actually like falls down a tube, and he didn't mean to do that, so he kind of screams out. And the dad, who is wandering around, not sure where he's going, hears Casey's yell and realizes it's on the other side of this thin wall. So he just runs through the wall. And this seems to be the wall of the eyeball, maybe in the center of the hand, because they're talking about it like it's an eye. And the narration says, "For a moment, Dan cannot think where he is. Then, as lens flexed light cascades around him, he notices the pupil and the iris. And as it illuminates, the internment buzzing of the eye's fabric seems to grow, swelling like the voice of millions. This must be the power. This must be the glory." So Dan is thinking that this is a sign from God. So he looks directly into the lens as the light's coming through, and he says, "Jesus Christ." But then the light begins to get brighter because it's being focused through a lens, and those focused rays hit his eyes, and the narration says, "And he is blinded by the light." So he can't see anymore, and the narration continues, "Groping like a madman through life's long passage, claiming to know and know nothing. He has always been blind. Yet an instinct beyond the five senses still pulls him along in the wake of his escaping son." So he is still kind of awkwardly chasing Casey, even though he can't see where he's going inside this crazy maze of plant life. So Casey continues to run, and eventually he gets to a chamber that looks a lot like a stomach. And just like a stomach, there's actual acid at the bottom of it. So he carefully climbs around all the roots and avoids the acid. But his dad, who's still following him and is blind, is just walking into this room. And he's kind of on the top of like a nodule that's sticking out. And he's saying, "I know you're right ahead of me, Casey. Gonna take you back to the light. Let it shine on you. Then you'll be just like your father, boy, a step nearer to God." And with that, his dad falls into the acid and is eaten alive, I guess, by the plant. And Casey doesn't even look back. He just keeps climbing, and eventually he gets out of the plant and he climbs down the outside of it where his mom is waiting for him. Then we turn to the last page and we're seeing the same areas that we did before, like the trailer park and that car that's dilapidated in the swamp, but everything looks a little bit older, a little bit more dingy, and the narration says, "The Spanish moss hangs gray, now in the limp light of the fall evening. Countless insects and green things have lived and died this summer gone. Life is so immense and so short. There is little left of the swamp plant, mostly just a fine dust shifting in the wind, impregnated with the spores of the fungus. New thing that it was, it had no resistance. Steve Cahill's caddy still rusts embedded in the levee. Parents still tell their children that it's dangerous to go playing around in it, and still the kids ignore them. Ed's picked his cotton, but he hasn't gotten around to plowing just yet. There's a stubble in the middle of the patch too, greener than the rest. Ed says it was a damn fine crop, and he grins an awful lot this fall. And in the trailer park, they say Dan Quigley upped and left again, same as always. No one seemed to rightly know what happened to the other Quigleys, till Irv got a letter from Casey, postmarked Missouri. They told him he could pick all the tomatoes he wanted. Right now, the trailer stands like some dead, old, empty husk, but Irv's heard that new folk will be moving in soon. Nothing's ever quite the same after growing season. And we see in the last panel that Irv is looking at a for rent sign on the trailer that Casey and his mom used to live in. And that is the end of the issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains.comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And always remember to stay swampy.